All right, thank you. Thank you for being here today. Really excited to talk to everyone about stained glass window preservation and the grants program. Say something if at any time I freeze or the slides stop working or you can't hear me anymore, but hopefully everything will go smoothly. My name is Megan Narvey. I'm the Outreach Conservator at the Minnesota Historical Society. So I work a lot with the grants program to review grant applications that have to do with like museum collections, historic objects, pieces of art, and decorative arts elements inside of historic properties. And I'm also presenting today with my colleague Ryan, and I'll let him introduce himself quickly.
Hi, I'm Ryan Maciej, and I'm one of the two design reviewers here at the Minnesota Historical Society in the Grants Department, and the other one is John Beatty. And depending upon where you are in the state of Minnesota, if you're in certain counties, I would be looking at the National Register historic properties, and if you're in other counties, it'd be John. And I'm excited to be here today, and I'm excited to learn some new things myself regarding a conservationist point of view from Megan.
All right, thanks, Ryan. So this is the summary of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'm going to talk about why stained glass window restoration projects are unique within the grants program. Then we'll dive into what the grant requirements are for both National Register and non-National Register properties. And finally, we'll provide some application suggestions. Stained glass windows are unique and they have special requirements with our grants program. That's because stained glass windows are both artistic elements and a part of the building's envelope. Preservation of these windows involves a fusion of historic preservation and art conservation. These projects can also be complicated because there are many different approaches to their conservation. A project could be very conservative and focus on in situ repairs and improving the environment, or it could be removing the window and completely reletting it. There are also several competing sets of professional standards for the preservation of stained glass, and they don't always agree with each other on the best approach to maintaining and caring for these windows. I'll get into all of these issues later in the presentation when I talk about application suggestions. Briefly, here's the structure of a stained glass window. Obviously, there are the panes of glass, which can sometimes be painted with even more detailed designs. These are held together by lead came, which is soldered together at all of the joints. The gaps between the glass and the lead are filled with a mixture called cement, which makes the windows waterproof. Rebar or saddle bars are attached to the window to provide structural support. So these are like steel bars. They're sometimes attached to the window using wire ties. And the entire window is fitted inside of a wood frame and then inside of a building, inside of a wall. Today, we're talking about the Minnesota Historical and Cultural Heritage Grants Program. This legacy-funded grant program provides funding for the preservation of Minnesota history. If you're interested in learning more about the grants in general, I recommend reading the grants manual, attending a open house, which is on the first Thursday of every month and they're virtual, or attending our quarterly Grants 101 webinar. Grant staff are also available to answer any questions you have if you contact us by email, and there's a quick email that you can use, grants@mnhs.org. That's a great way to get in touch with the grant staff. Some important things to know are that grant applications are all submitted online through a grants portal, which you need your own account to access. Stained glass window projects are likely to fall into either our small grant or large grant categories. Small grants are less than $10,000, and we have deadlines 4 times a year. If your application is returned, you'll get feedback on how to resubmit, and it's not long until there's another grant deadline. Typically, only minor restoration projects or planning projects would come into the small round. Most stained glass window restoration projects would come in over $10,000, so they would go through our large grants round. This happens once a year, and there's a required pre-application. This is so that we have the chance to give you feedback on strengthening your application before it goes before the external review committee. Again, if you have any questions about the grants, please reach out to one of us by email. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan.
Hello. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about stained glass when it pertains to National Register properties. So this is when National Register buildings or structures happen to have stained glass and walls and that type of thing. And when stained glass is part of a building listed in the National Register of Historic Places, a design reviewer is usually assigned. And Minnesota has a wide variety of historic National Register buildings that have stained glass windows that are character defining features of the building. If you notice maybe some of the Second Empire buildings from the 1860s and 70s, sometimes they'll have more ornate panels, especially in some of the religious buildings or spiritual buildings. And then as time goes on to like the prairie and mid-century modern styles, you'll see, of course, more geometric design. Sometimes they can be more fanciful, but usually in rectilinear elements. So sometimes circles, but generally squares and rectangles. And we actually have a diverse set of artisans and glass types that are featured around the state. We have all kinds of really well-known stained glass designers that are represented in the state, to people who were more local, more vernacular, showing kind of their own maybe folk style in the state. Even up till today, there's a lot of stained glass designers, conservators, and so it's really exciting seeing that there's more than I think what a lot of people anticipate there to be. And these things actually help date and define the building style, so that if you can see when the stained glass was put in, oftentimes you can see a little bit about when the building was constructed, if they did additions, and so forth. And if you could advance to the next page, that would be great. Oh, and incidentally, this is that was the Cass Gilbert church, the an Episcopal church up in Moorhead. And this one here is the Dinahart Holt house in Slayton, and it's really cool if you can get historic pictures of stained glass. This came from a historic structure report that they did. And so how we look at it, like with National Register, is, we team with Megan in conservation, and we look at what it's like in situ. In other words, sort of, in that surrounding. So we look at what the walls, and we look at how the meteorological conditions have impacted it. The reason why I included this one is because that's next to a stair where they would have had, imagine 300, 400, 500 pounds carrying things up and down the stairs, heavy things. So the vibration, the seismic vibration from people, and all that takes a toll. So, that's kind of one of those types of things that we look at. And also we want to be sure that the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties are being met. And that's something that we look at because that's actually part of, the grants program when there's something relating to a National Register historic property that's taking place. And I guess we can advance to the next slide. And here is actually a pretty well-known example. This is Glensheen Mansion on the North Shore here in Minnesota, just in the northern reaches of Duluth. So there actually are sort of some different requirements for National Register properties. If you have stained glass in a National Register property, you would actually apply under historic preservation projects, and you can go to our grants manual online and actually find out what that process entails. And it actually, for National Register listed buildings, the construction work must be based on construction documents that are completed by a qualified historic architect. And we also then, as I mentioned, the work must conform to the Secretary of the Interior standards, and it also must incorporate 4 types of information. 1, construction drawings, 2, photographs, 3, a photo key, and 4, a scope of work form. And then the next one. Oh, great, thanks. This one is an example of one of the stained glass windows from the early 20th century at St. Clement's and St. Paul. Which is also on the National Register. And so there's, as you can imagine, a lot of different things that are required for stained glass windows that are really special because they can be, really, they can be very brittle. Things can have happened to them. Sometimes the glass is layered. Some of the designers that, did certain kinds of work had utilize layering techniques that become, harder to deal with. So scaffolding installation, wooden frame repair and painting, boarding up the window while it's out for repair, actually taking it down and putting it back up, that to me can be kind of scary a little bit. And then also the installation of storm windows. And storm windows are looked at, it's nice also if they're impact resistant and if they ventilate a little bit. And the scope of work form and the construction documents should include details on these types of elements. And so that concludes the National Register property component of the presentation. Back to Megan.
Thanks, Ryan. I actually have one more little piece of information about National Register properties, and that's when I get called in to look at National Register property applications, it's because of this line in the grants manual, which I've highlighted here in the slide. It says that treatment of architectural decorative arts elements, including stained glass windows, should comply with the Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice of the American Institute for Conservation, also called AIC. Conservation documentation, including a condition report and treatment proposal, should be included in any application for treatment. I'll discuss this a bit more during the section on application suggestions. And then I'll move on to non-National Register properties. So, can properties and museums apply for the preservation of stained glass windows? The answer is yes. In this case, you apply under the history projects category rather than under the historic preservation category. For these projects, the grants requirements are a little bit different. We don't have the same requirements about following the Secretary of Interior standards because these typically aren't historic properties that are on the National Register that are having work done to them under the history projects category. If they would, they'd have to go under Ryan's category, historic preservation. So we don't have the scope of work form or the construction documents or the historic architect, although I'm not saying that you don't need to do that if your building is old and you want to preserve it. What I'm saying is that the grants manual is a little bit different when it comes to conservation treatment. All conservation treatments that come through the history projects category with the Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice of the AIC. So National Register properties, they have a little bit more leeway because they actually have to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards. These have preference over the AIC Code of Ethics in cases where they might conflict. But in the history projects category, the AIC Code of Ethics has precedence, and you have to follow that. In a second, I'm going to talk more about the AIC Code of Ethics, but in brief, it's a code of ethics that talks about how conservation treatment should proceed. It includes information about what kind of treatments are suitable, whether or not treatments are reversible, and employing materials in your treatments that are consistent with currently accepted conservation practices. If you have any questions about this and the grant program requirements, again, I'm happy to try to explain them a little bit, but for the most part, most stained glass projects come in under historic properties. Very few of them come in under history projects. Here's a little flow chart showing how conservation treatment projects should proceed. So this is required for history projects, restoration projects, and it's strongly recommended for historic properties. So the first step is object examination, where your consultant closely looks at the object and they produce a condition report and treatment proposal. This step could be completed using a small grant. The final product of this small grant would be the physical report, the condition report, and treatment proposal, which can then be used as an attachment in a subsequent application for the treatment of the stained glass window, which would most often be a large grant. The final product of the large grant is the treatment report, where the consultant describes the materials and methods used during the project. All right, so we've gone over the grant program requirements. I want to get into some application suggestions. And I'm going to preface this by saying that all of the information I'm going to share today in the application suggestions is summarized in a really handy tip sheet that the Grants Office has produced, which can be found on our website. I have the link included here, and yeah, Gillian just posted the link in the chat too. Thank you. During this section of the presentation, I'm going to briefly describe the applicable professional standards for stained glass window preservation and provide some information about the guidance they provide for treatment. And then I'll share a couple of resources for finding a consultant. These are the primary applicable professional standards that I drew from when creating these suggestions. I'm going to introduce each of these to you briefly so that you understand what they are and what they mean. The first is the AIC Code of Ethics, which I've already mentioned a couple of times. The AIC Code of Ethics is mentioned by name in the grants manual. Stained glass projects and National Register properties should follow the Code of Ethics. Stained glass projects that are not in National Register properties must follow the Code of Ethics. So what is this code? It's developed by the Professional Organization for Conservators in the US. It represents the ethical consensus on the conservation of cultural materials in this country. It's available to view online. Some key points from this code of ethics include the importance of treatment reversibility, minimal intervention, thorough documentation, and the importance of preventive measures, by which I mean improving conditions to prevent damage from occurring in the first place. Next up is, the remaining sets of standards that I'm going to talk about here are not mentioned by name in the grants manual, but they do provide important context and specificity for stained glass treatment. And so they're taken into consideration when I was working on that tip sheet. So first off, the standards and guidelines for the treatment of stained glass windows by the Stained Glass Association of America. This document belongs to a trade association that provides accreditation to stained glass studios, both in the creation of stained glass windows and the restoration of stained glass windows. Accreditation for this organization means that the professional member has gone through a 4-year process of review. The accredited members then work together to maintain these standards. Some key points from these standards are do no harm, reuse or preserve original material whenever possible, the importance of documentation, using reversible methods unless loss is imminent, and the important point that windows should remain within their original architectural context. The next set of standards is Preservation Brief 33, the preservation and repair of historic stained and leaded glass. This is one document from a series of publications by the National Park Service, recommend methods and approaches for rehabilitating historic buildings. The document is available online. It provides treatment recommendations for stained glass windows and historic properties. I don't have a good summary of it for you. It's not super long, so it's not too hard to read through, and it has lots of interesting historic context on stained glass windows in this country. The final set of standards I'd like to mention are the guidelines for the conservation and restoration of stained glass produced by the Corpus Vitrium, which is an international scholarly organization focused entirely on research of historic stained glass. The document is available online. It focuses on full documentation, preventive measures, and all treatment guided by the principles of minimal intervention and reversibility. This is the most conservative of all the stained glass guidelines. For example, these guidelines recommend preserving the lead came in a window rather than replacing it, which is a standard recommendation in the two previous standards that I mentioned. All right, so what does this all mean? It's confusing to hear that there are so many different sets of standards for the restoration of stained glass windows. Which one should you pick? How do you know if your consultant is following the right set of standards to meet grant requirements? In the next few slides, I'm going to summarize some of the key points from these 4 sets of standards, which you can, again, read in the tip sheet. So first, some general recommendations. All stained glass windows deserve to be treated the same manner, regardless of perceived value. Values change over time, and treatment should be based on the condition of the window rather than how important you think the window is right now. If circumstances limit resources, you should approach restoration in phases rather than compromising on the quality of the work. Very importantly, the preservation of stained glass windows should be well documented and emphasize repair over replacement, treatment reversibility, and the use of preventive conservation measures where possible. Let's talk about documentation. You need to provide information for the reviewers to assess whether the project meets the required standards. Documentation is also a critical part of meeting the required standards. So this includes detailed photographs. Overall and close-up shots of the window should be taken before the window is removed and after the window is reinstalled at the end of treatment. It's also really useful to take photos during the treatment. Other than photographs, there are 2 reports that should be produced during a stained glass restoration project, which I've already mentioned them before. The first is the condition report and treatment plan, which must be done before treatment and ideally would be included in your grant application. This slide contains examples of the kind of information you should find in this report. A description of the window, information about the condition of the window, details of the proposed treatment, and specific information about the materials that will be used during treatment. I have examples of what all of these bits of information might be in the slide. After treatment, your consultant should prepare your treatment report, which includes a complete description of all the materials and methods used during the treatment. This should be provided in the grant's final report after the treatment is completed. So this is a case where if you're working in a National Register property, some of this information would be covered in your construction documents and your scope of work form. This is okay, but ideally I'd like to see a separate document that goes in some depth about the information provided on this slide. And another thing, some consultants might provide a handout that lists the standard treatment process they undertake for every stained glass restoration project. Again, this is okay, but a better application would include specific information for each unique window rather than assuming each window is identical. If you're applying under the history projects category, then you have to have a treatment proposal before the application to be considered. All right, cleaning. For the next few slides, I've highlighted some of the most common treatment options and things to watch out for when you're reviewing a treatment proposal. So cleaning. In general, stained glass windows should be cleaned starting with the most gentle option. Acidic, caustic, abrasive, or ammonia-containing cleaners should never be used, so no Windex. One thing to watch out for here is that the professional standards don't agree on whether it's appropriate for stained glass windows to be soaked in water. Some believe that this is a necessary component for a complete restoration, while others believe that cleaning should be more carefully applied to prevent damage to the window. If you see this in your treatment proposal, look for a reason why. If your stained glass window includes delicate or painted surfaces, you may want to go with a more careful route. The repair of stained glass windows should take into account the condition of the window, its environment, risks versus anticipated benefits, and safety. Windows should be treated based on their specific needs. If you have a set of 8 windows restored, they should each have their own treatment plan that's specific to them, rather than assuming that they will all just get the exact same treatment regardless of their condition. Something to think about. The professional standards have a philosophical disagreement about whether the lead cane is a sacrificial element of a stained glass window, like mortar is to brick, or whether it's an integral part of the historic nature of the window and contributes to its value. Many treatment protocols include removing and replacing all of the lead cane. Make sure that your consultant explains why this is necessary. Obviously, you want your restored window to be structurally sound and functional for many years to come, but you also want to avoid unnecessary change if the lead cane is still in reasonably good condition. There are some types of repairs that can be done without removing the window from the wall, including repairing a few pieces of broken glass and adding in additional structural support if it's required to create a strong, sound window. However, flattening and straightening a window in situ should not be done, as this will result in cracks in the lead and the glass. This is something that all of the standards are in universal agreement about. Doing this results in an unstable window that will rapidly deteriorate. It is possible to flatten a window without removing and replacing all of the lead by removing it from the wall and slowly flattening it in a horizontal position. So there are different approaches to straightening and flattening, but it should not happen in situ. Some more things to watch out for. Total reletting of a window should only happen when it's necessary because the existing lead cane is in really poor condition and the window is in danger. Broken glass should be repaired whenever possible because replacement glass rarely looks exactly the same and it doesn't have the same historic value. Ideally, all treatment materials should be distinguishable from the original materials of the window, removable without causing damage, and they should have long-term chemical stability. Glazing is a hugely important part of the preservation of a stained glass window. Well-constructed glazing will help the windows remain in good condition for many years. They protect the window from the weather and from vandalism, but glazing must be ventilated to reduce the risk of condensation and heat gain. So there are a lot of different materials and methods for glazing stained glass windows. The important thing is that they're ventilated. Another important thing is that the glazing should match the outside of the window as closely as possible so it doesn't obscure or obstruct the view of the window from the outside. You want it to look as natural as possible. And in a historic property on the National Register, this is very, very important, as Ryan can attest. All right, my final section here, finding a consultant. First off, at all National Register listed buildings, construction work must be based on construction documents completed by a qualified historic architect. The historic architect will work with the stained glass specialist to prepare any documents related to the repair of stained glass windows. If you're selecting your own consultant, look at their education, experience, and references. They should have lead safety certification and familiarity with the professional standards discussed today. They should be willing and able to complete a condition report treatment proposal, thorough photo documentation, and a treatment report. They should be able to explain all aspects of the treatment to you and explain why they're necessary and important. Here are some websites that you can use to find stained glass specialists. You can use the Preservation Specialists Directory, which is hosted on the Minnesota Historical Society website and has a list of all sorts of different consultants that specialize in history projects, including conservators and architects. You can also use the Find a Conservator database by the American Institute for Conservation. You can also look for an accredited stained glass studio through the Stained Glass Association of America. Referrals are another great way to find qualified consultants. Remember that for grant funding, you must meet the procurement criteria by reaching out to at least 3 consultants or creating an RFP. It depends on how much money you're requesting in your grants project, exactly what the requirement is. So review the grant manual to learn more about procurement. And that's it for me. And here's some contact information for me and Ryan and for our grants administrators. If you have any questions, now is a great time to ask them. You can also send them to us by email if you're shy and don't want to be videoed, recorded while you ask your questions. All right, Melissa, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so we've had, some issues trying to find comparable conservators to have those 3 bids, so to speak. We have, of course, everybody's looking toward the Midwest Art Conservation Center folks, but there's really not many conservation folks in the area. We reached out to others in Chicago, and either the flying is not preferable or the time period is not preferable either. But I also have looked on your various resources and found restorers. And when we initially sent it out to bid for, we had involved a couple of restorers, and one of them, just his methodology was different than Mac's, what Mac was, the conservator there was offering. And we kind of decided, okay, we're not going to do restorers anymore because they're not the same standards as a conservator. But it's just painful trying to find somebody else besides Mac to offer a comparable. So as long as we've done our due diligence, is that okay? Is that, like we reached out to conservators and said, here, I know you're in Chicago, but we're looking for people to bid on this, and they come back with us, sorry, can't do it, flying or whatever else is not possible right now. Is that a thing?
Yes. It depends on the procurement requirement specifically, but like typically it's about doing your due diligence, following the recommendations or requirements that we have, whether it's reaching out to 3 consultants or posting your RFP publicly. It doesn't really matter if you only find one consultant that is the right consultant for the job for you, because you only need one consultant to do the job for you anyway. So yeah. And there are lots of
did that answer your question, Melissa?
Yes, it did. I have another one later, so I'll let somebody else ask questions.
Do you want to? Did you say you did have another question, Melissa? Do you want to go ahead and ask that? And
I do. So we have, maybe this is kind of splitting here, but we have a couple of large grants planned to submit, obviously this year, and then we have another phase of another construction project phase for next year, assuming so we also came in at a much higher rate for the 3rd set of those windows that we want to do in the main stairwell. And so we're getting to the point basically where our match would be higher than the $10,000 needed, or almost higher. So at this point I was kind of thinking maybe we should put it into the larger grant, but can we do the larger grant for like our carriage house, which is sort of kind of, on a roll, and submit a much smaller one for these windows? Would that be not recommended?
Well, I'll let Ryan can answer more of the detail, but are those are totally unrelated projects, right? It's different, they're
Correct.
different buildings.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct.
So if they're different projects, we don't have any, there's no reason that you can't
Okay.
do that. It might be, you know, as you know from the large rounds, like it could potentially be a little less competitive, but not, I can't see a reason why it really would be. If you're submitting two large grant applications that are unrelated, it's unlikely you would get both.
Okay.
But a small and a large, as long as they're unrelated projects, lots of people do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Did that answer that? Did I
Yeah.
understand your question
Yeah.
right? Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have someone on the phone here. I wonder if that's Megan.
It's Megan. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes.
My internet just completely decided to die, so I called in. The timing is impeccable.
It looks like, Megan, you have another question from Octavian.
All right, let's hear it.
Hi,
Can you read it out loud?
everybody. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. Well, they were great as usual. So at my small church, we have restored. There are several windows. We have restored or repaired a few, but what Father is telling me is that there are still a few more, a couple more. Is that acceptable? Because this would be like you know, applying for a grant for, you know, for a partial, for just a few windows out of the you know, the full number of them. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's definitely okay. And in some ways, it's better because you get to focus on just a couple of windows instead of trying to get all of them completed during the set of time. So
Yeah, I get it. And we're not we are a non-NR building, although it's fairly old. We haven't, you know, there's a resistance of the people who actually make the decisions to enroll them into the NR because of all the limitations, you know, which limitations are good, but they require then a lot more funding and effort and intellectual effort and so on and so forth, getting experts. So that's, I guess it's normal. But of course, there's a spot for the non-NR buildings as well, as you said, and I will read that manual and try to get in the January cycle.
yeah, stained glass windows have a sort of special place in that they can go in either type of project, but that's because they're special, beautiful, artistic elements of the building. Most construction projects in buildings aren't eligible unless they're a National Register property. So,
yeah,
stained glass windows are special, though.
I understand. Yeah, they're not very complicated, not very elaborate. So, anyways, I'll stay in touch with you guys. I don't want to take more of your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
I have one more. We have been looking at, I'm still trying to dig into nano ceramic technology, but I haven't got very far. So I'm going to back up a little bit and go back to the original plan of putting UV coating on our storm windows so that we can be protected at least, you know, part of the year. Would a grant cover that?
Nano ceramic protection,
No,
or
just regular UV? Just regular UV.
Yes, we do fund UV films on windows, specifically for museums, but probably also for other types of buildings as well. But yes, you would be eligible.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have today.
Thank you.
Thank you.